What would you do if the people next door called the police on you for simply floating a boat in your own lake? Imagine the shock, the confusion, the sheer disbelief. That's exactly what happened to Cornell Dupree, a 46-year-old rancher in northern Texas, whose quiet life of sun-baked fields, rolling grass, and a beloved private lake turned into a scene of suspicion, stares, and sirens. This is the story of a man whose dignity was challenged, and how he turned an act of humiliation into a strategic triumph that shook an entire neighborhood. Cornell wasn't flashy. He didn't drive a sports car or live in a gated mansion. His pride was rooted in his land. His ranch, stretching across miles of Texas terrain where the oaks leaned toward the water, and the lake mirrored endless skies. This lake, tucked quietly within his property, was where he found peace, away from the relentless heat and chaos of the outside world. On that morning, the sun glinted gently off the water, promising a calm, slow day. Cornell lowered his flat-bottom boat into the lake, the hull scraping lightly against the soft mud at the shore. He untied the rope, nudged it with his boots, and let himself drift, letting the world fade behind him. But serenity doesn't last forever. The shrill wail of sirens tore through the air, sharper than any distant highway noise. Flashing red and blue lights appeared near the subdivision's marina across the water. Two sheriff's deputies stepped out of their patrol car, eyes scanning the lake. And there, front and center, stood Janice Kettering, the HOA president, clipboard in hand, radiating authority far beyond her actual jurisdiction. She was in her late 50s, known in the neighborhood for strict rules, fines, and a schedule of control that few dared challenge. Her message was clear even before she spoke. Cornell did not belong here. "Sir, we're going to need you to come in for a moment," shouted one deputy. Cornell's chest tightened. His oar hovered in the water. "This is my lake," he called across the waves, his voice steady but carrying enough strength to be heard. Janice raised her voice over his. "That water belongs to the subdivision. You can't just use it like you own the place." The world seemed to pause. Neighbors whispered, some filming, others shielding their eyes as Cornell maneuvered his boat back to shore, the gravel crunching under approaching boots. "Mind showing us some ID?" asked the deputy politely but firmly. Cornell handed it over, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing into him. Comments cut through the murmurs. "Who is he? Doesn't look like he lives here. Get this on video." Cornell straightened, holding up his head. "This lake is on my deed. My ranch line runs straight through here. I have the paperwork to prove it." The deputy glanced at Janice. She stiffened. "That's not what our records say," she muttered. "I know what I bought," Cornell said, the calm in his voice slicing through the tension. "You do not have the right to call me a trespasser on my own property." The silence stretched, uncomfortable. Finally, the deputy handed back the ID. "Sir, if you've got the deed, then you're within your rights. Ma'am, unless there's evidence otherwise, there's no violation here." Janice pressed her lips tight but did not back down, scribbling something on her clipboard. Cornell stepped back toward his boat, hands trembling. Not from fear, but from the sting of humiliation. He had been forced to defend his right to be on land that was legally his, in front of strangers who now saw him as an intruder. As he pushed back into the water, the calm he had sought that morning was gone, replaced by a simmering realization. This confrontation was only the beginning, and Cornell didn't yet know how deeply it would reshape the neighborhood. That night, sleep was a stranger. The flashing patrol lights haunted him. The murmuring neighbors, their whispers, the sharp glare of Janice Kettering. It all pressed into him like the weight of the Texas sun at noon. Owning land in Texas was more than a title, it was dignity. And yesterday, in front of half the neighborhood, that dignity had been dragged through the mud. By morning, Cornell sat at his kitchen table, staring at the lake through the window. Mist rose off the water's surface, calm and inviting, yet the thought of pushing his boat out there again churned his stomach. Sharon, his wife, set a plate of eggs and toast in front of him. "You going back out there today?" she asked gently. Cornell shook his head. "Not today. I don't feel like giving them another show." Sharon's voice was steady, filled with warmth. Cornell, you did nothing wrong. That lake is ours. They made fools of themselves, not you. He stirred his coffee slowly, weighing her words. Maybe so, but when the deputies show up because someone thinks you don't belong, it sticks with you. People recorded it. They won't post the part where I showed my deed. They'll post me standing there, like I needed permission. Sharon reached across the table, squeezing his hand. Then you stand taller. Show them who you are. Cornell exhaled, willing himself to believe her. But the image of Janice's glare and the crowd's whispers lingered. Later that week, a conversation at the hardware store would plant the seed that changed everything. Franklin Yates, a neighbor in his 60s with a sun-weathered face, leaned against Cornell's truck. Heard about what happened down at the lake, he said, a knowing smile tugging at his lips. Cornell tightened the tie on a sack of grain. I'm sure everyone heard, he said flatly. Franklin chuckled. Yeah, word travels fast. Listen, I know Janice. She likes to run her mouth more than she should. Don't take it personal. Cornell's gaze hardened. How am I supposed to take it? She called the cops on me. In my own water. Franklin nodded slowly. Fair point. But you know how these HOA types are, rules make them feel powerful. She's been running that subdivision like her own kingdom for years. People go along with it because most don't want the trouble. Cornell crossed his arms. So they just let her decide who belongs and who doesn't? Franklin shrugged. Pretty much. But between you and me, she doesn't speak for everybody. Not everyone agreed with her pulling that stunt. Cornell studied him, then nodded. Good to hear. At least one person's got sense. Franklin tipped his hat and walked off, leaving Cornell with the thought that maybe, just maybe, not everyone in the crowd saw him as an outsider. But the humiliation lingered, a shadow he couldn't shake. He would soon learn that the real fight was only beginning, and it would lead him to a decision that would flip the entire neighborhood upside down. If you think this is just a story about a boat and a lake, you're only seeing the surface. Wait until you see what Cornell does next. It's bold, it's unexpected, and it will change everything. Don't forget to click the subscribe button so you don't miss how this quiet Texas rancher turns the tables on an entire HOA. Cornell couldn't get the confrontation out of his mind. Every flicker of sunlight on the lake reminded him of the murmurs, the flashing patrol lights, and the eyes of neighbors that had judged him like a stranger. That humiliation gnawed at him, but beneath it was something else, an ember of determination. He refused to let one moment define him or his ownership of the land he had nurtured for decades. Days passed and the story followed him everywhere. Stopping for feed, fuel, or groceries, someone always had a comment. Some spoke in whispers, others in bold, curious tones. One afternoon, at the grocery store in Denton, a woman he barely knew from church approached him in the produce aisle. Cornell, I saw that video on Facebook. Couldn't believe it. You handled yourself so calmly. But people were talking. Cornell's jaw tightened. Talking about what? He asked. She glanced around, lowering her voice. About whether you even owned the lake. Some folks said the HOA wouldn't have called if they weren't sure. Cornell clenched his fists around the cart. I've got the deed. The lake is mine. Clear as day. She nodded quickly. I believe you, but you know how people are. Once it's online, it takes on a life of its own. Cornell let the conversation end there, tossing potatoes into his cart as if the woman's whispered doubts were another piece of lumber to carry. Back at home, Sharon showed him a clip someone had uploaded to a local community Facebook group. It showed him rowing back to shore, deputies waiting, captioned, Local man argues with HOA over restricted lake use. The video had over 1,000 views, dozens of comments, some defending him, some against. Cornell stared at the screen, a hollow feeling deep in his chest. All the hours under the punishing Texas sun, hauling fence posts, fixing irrigation, caring for the lake. It didn't matter. In a few minutes, strangers had painted him as an outsider, a trespasser, and the entire neighborhood had swallowed the story like gospel. Yet, beneath the frustration, an idea began to crystallize. forming quietly in his mind. The HOA had shown its hand. Power without authority could be challenged. And maybe it was time he found a way to reclaim his peace and his dignity not just by words, but by action. Later that week, he stopped by the hardware store for more feed. As he loaded sacks into the back of his truck, Franklin Yates, the neighbor who had first hinted that not everyone in the HOA agreed with Janice's aggressive control, walked over. "Heard about the lake incident," Franklin said, leaning casually against the truck bed. "I know it shook you." Cornell nodded, not speaking. Franklin continued, "You know, Janice, she likes running things like a queen ruling a kingdom. People go along because most don't want trouble. But not everyone is with her." Cornell lifted his head, locking eyes with Franklin. "Not everyone?" "Not everyone," Franklin confirmed with a small, knowing smile. "Some of us still have common sense." Cornell let the words sink in, a flicker of hope lighting behind his eyes. Maybe there was a path forward, something that wouldn't just restore his dignity but could shift the balance entirely. A seed of an audacious idea had been planted, waiting for the right moment to grow. That moment came in a casual conversation at the feed store a few days later. Cornell was paying for supplies when two men behind him started talking about the subdivision's marina. "You hear the docks are falling apart again?" one said. "Yeah," the other replied. "They keep saying they'll fix it, but the truth is they don't own it outright. Belongs to some old guy out in Gainesville, they just lease the slips." Cornell froze, pretending to fumble with his change. His mind raced. The HOA didn't own the marina. Janice's clipboard, her aura of absolute control, wasn't backed by property ownership. Her power was borrowed, temporary, built on perception rather than reality. Driving home, the thought circled relentlessly. If he could acquire the marina, he wouldn't just defend his lake. He could hold leverage over those who had humiliated him. He could transform a moment of shame into a position of undeniable strength. That evening, he discussed it with Sharon over sweet tea. "The marina," he began slowly, leaning back in his chair. "They don't actually own it. HOA just leases the slips." Sharon raised an eyebrow. "How'd you find that out?" "Feed store gossip," Cornell admitted. "But it makes sense. They don't have the money to maintain something that big. Not the way Janice runs things." Sharon studied him, leaning back thoughtfully. "You're not just telling me this for fun, are you?" Cornell smiled faintly. "No, not for fun. This could change everything." The plan was not fully formed. It began as curiosity, then a simmering need for justice, and finally a calculated idea. Cornell knew he had to approach it carefully. He had to gather information, understand the owner, and prepare for every eventuality. He couldn't let pride or anger dictate his actions. This had to be done smartly, deliberately. The very next morning, he drove to the Denton County Clerk's office, a building heavy with the scent of paper and dust. Filing cabinets towered around him, computers humming quietly. Cornell approached the clerk, a middle-aged man with reading glasses perched low on his nose. "I need ownership records for Lakeside Marina on Highway 377, he said. The clerk typed and searched, eventually pulling a file. "Marina's owned by a Mr. Raymond Lockhart, out of Gainesville. Been in his name for about 15 years. Property taxes were late last year, but nothing major." Cornell leaned forward, absorbing every detail. A spark of opportunity flared. If the HOA didn't own it and the current owner was willing, maybe this was the way to shift the power. That evening, he called an old friend, Victor Green, a real estate professional. They met at a diner, the kind with vinyl booths and pies that tasted like home. Cornell laid out what he'd learned. Victor chuckled. "Everyone in Gainesville knows Ray owns that marina. Why would you want that headache?" Cornell's eyes hardened. "Because respect isn't given. Sometimes it's earned, and sometimes it's bought." Victor studied him, then nodded slowly. "All right, I'll reach out. If you're serious, I'll make it happen." As he drove back to the ranch that evening, Cornell felt something he hadn't in weeks. Not humiliation, not anger, but control. The plan was forming. The next step would be delicate, strategic, and bold. And once set in motion, it would change everything for the neighborhood, for the HOA, and for the man who had spent decades building a life on that lake. What Cornell learned about that marina would ignite a chain of events no one saw coming. Would he succeed? Could a quiet Texas rancher truly flip the power of an entire neighborhood? Hit that subscribe button, because the next chapter will show how a man humiliated on his own property began a bold, audacious plan that nobody expected. The morning sun stretched across the Texas horizon, casting long shadows over the ranch. Cornell Dupree drove north, the asphalt unwinding in front of him like a promise. His mind raced, retracing every detail he'd gathered about Lakeside Marina. The owner, Raymond Lockhart, was in his 70s, a man who had kept the property for over 15 years, and, according to the county records, was quietly trying to offload it. The revelation that the HOA didn't own the marina ignited something inside Cornell. A calculated fire he had no intention of letting burn out. By midday, his old Chevy rumbled into Gainesville, dust swirling behind him as if announcing his arrival. Lockhart's house came into view, an aging brick ranch with a sagging porch and a rusted boat trailer in the driveway. Simple, unassuming, but holding the key to a potential shift in the balance of power. Cornell parked and took a deep breath, feeling a rare mix of anticipation and resolve. Today wasn't about vengeance, it was about reclaiming respect, and perhaps, teaching the HOA a lesson they'd never forget. Lockhart stood waiting outside, tall, wiry, beard flecked with gray, hands calloused like the history of labor itself etched into his skin. "You must be Dupree," Lockhart said, voice gravelly, carrying the weight of years and experience. "Heard you're interested in my headache down at the lake." Cornell nodded, extending his hand. "I heard you've been trying to sell for a while." Lockhart smirked, motioning toward a couple of lawn chairs on the porch. "Trying, yeah. But most folks want shiny and new. My marina's neither. Dock's rotting, insurance eats half the profit, and every year it's more trouble than it's worth." Cornell took a seat, elbows resting on his knees, the afternoon sun warming his face. "I know the value of what you've got. Not the wood, not the paint, but the location. That marina feeds into the subdivision. They rely on it, and I can take care of it responsibly." Lockhart chuckled dryly, exhaling a thin plume of smoke from a cigarette. "Most people sniff around to tear it down for condos. You don't look like the condo type." Cornell's eyes met his steadily. "Because I'm not looking to profit off people. I'm looking to assert ownership, yes, but also respect. 2 weeks ago, the HOA called the cops on me while I was fishing my own lake. I want to make sure that doesn't happen again. I want to hold the leverage so they can't erase me or anyone else from property they depend on." Lockhart paused, squinting against the sun, studying Cornell like a farmer weighing a horse at auction. "You're serious?" "I'm serious," Cornell replied firmly, feeling a calm certainty settle in his chest. "I know what's right, and I intend to do it." The old man let out a low whistle. "All right, let's talk numbers." Victor Green, Cornell's real estate ally, slid a folder across the porch chair, filled with market comps and estimates. Lockhart skimmed through, tapping his cigarette against the armrest. The price he set was higher than Cornell expected, reflecting the prime lakeside location, even if the infrastructure was worn. Cornell listened carefully. He didn't haggle like a man desperate for a deal. He offered a counterproposal, fair but firm, signaling seriousness and credibility. Lockhart leaned back, smoke curling around his face, and finally nodded. "You come back with financing in 30 days, it's yours. Otherwise, I'm done trying to sell." Cornell extended his hand again. Lockhart shook it, rough but steady, sealing an unspoken pact. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden reflections across the porch, Cornell felt a sense of control he hadn't experienced since the incident on his lake. The humiliation of that day, the whispers, the flashing patrol lights, they had all led him to this moment. On the drive home, Victor glanced at him. "You really going through with this? Repairs, insurance, potential lawsuits if the HOA resists. It's going to be a mess." Cornell's eyes never left the road. "I've worked my whole life for this ranch. They tried to strip me of dignity in front of everyone. I'm not backing down now. By the time he pulled into the driveway, the sun had melted behind the horizon, leaving the lake shimmering under the fading light. Sharon was outside, tending to the garden. She looked up, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "Quiet," she said, pulling a chair beside him. Cornell leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "They think they can write me out, like I don't belong in what I built with my own hands." Sharon's hand rested gently on his shoulder. "So what are you going to do?" Cornell looked past her, eyes fixed on the placid water. "Something they won't forget," he murmured. "But first I need to know everything about that marina. Its ownership, its debts, its weak points. Knowledge is the foundation of action." The research began immediately. He visited county offices, poring over documents. He dug into property taxes, maintenance records, and lease agreements. Every scrap of information was a piece of the puzzle. By the end of the week, he had a clear picture. The HOA's influence was built on perception, not ownership. Their authority over the marina was borrowed, their control tenuous. Cornell shared his findings with Sharon that night. "They don't actually own it. If I move on this, I can change the game entirely." Sharon studied him, a mix of concern and admiration in her eyes. "And you will?" Cornell smiled faintly. "I will. But smart, not impulsive. Every move measured. Every step deliberate." In the quiet of the Texas night, as crickets sang and the lake shimmered under the moonlight, Cornell felt a rare certainty. He was no longer a man reacting to humiliation. He was a man planning action, a strategy that would shift the balance of power in a neighborhood that had tried to erase him. The next step was crucial. Could Cornell secure the marina and flip the HOA's control on its head? The answer would not only restore his dignity but also challenge an entire community's perception of authority. Hit that subscribe button because what happens next will redefine the power dynamics in ways nobody saw coming. 30 days later, the sun was high over Denton County as Cornell Dupree parked his Chevy outside the bank. The weight of anticipation pressed against him, heavier than the sacks of feed he hauled every week at the ranch. Today wasn't about livestock or crops. It was about claiming control over the marina and, in a quiet but undeniable way, reclaiming respect that had been challenged on his own property. Victor Green joined him at the entrance, folder in hand, papers meticulously organized. "You ready?" he asked, adjusting his cap against the glare. Cornell nodded, straightening his back. "I'm ready. It's time to close this chapter the right way." Inside, the bank smelled faintly of polished wood and freshly printed contracts. A loan officer ushered them to a corner office where Raymond Lockhart already waited, a faint smile on his weathered face. Cornell extended a firm hand. "Thank you for meeting today, Mr. Lockhart. I intend to honor the property and its value." Lockhart chuckled softly, taking the seat across from him. "I appreciate honesty. Most folks want shiny and new or want to tear it down. You're not the usual buyer." Cornell placed the deed on the table. "I intend to keep it as it is responsibly. This marina isn't just a piece of property. It's access, it's livelihood, it's community, and I intend to protect that." The negotiations were straightforward. Lockhart needed assurance the transaction would close without delay. Cornell needed confirmation that the marina, once under his ownership, would give him the leverage to prevent future harassment from the HOA. Victor guided the paperwork efficiently, and within hours the deal was done. Cornell Dupree was now the legal owner of Lakeside Marina. On the drive home, a quiet sense of satisfaction settled in his chest. Not because he wanted power over his neighbors, but because he now had the means to ensure no one could undermine his dignity again. The flashing lights, the murmurs, the surveillance from phones. They had all been part of a narrative he couldn't control in the moment. Now, with the marina legally his, he controlled the narrative. Word traveled faster than Cornell anticipated. By the time he stopped for feed at the local store, whispers and nods followed him. Franklin Yates, the neighbor who had quietly supported him all along, tipped his hat from across the aisle. "Well, I'll be... Heard you bought the marina," he said with a faint grin. Cornell gave a small nod, loading the last sack into his truck. "Word travels," he said simply. Franklin chuckled, a subtle spark of camaraderie passing between them. The notion that some had doubted him didn't matter anymore. Action had eclipsed rumor. That evening, Cornell drove past the Marina, its docks weathered but intact, boats gently rocking in their slips. A few subdivision residents were down there preparing for the weekend, carrying coolers and fishing gear. Heads turned as Cornell's truck rolled by. Conversations trailed off. Even the murmurs of disbelief held a tinge of respect. Cornell parked at a distance, observing quietly. The power dynamic had shifted subtly but irrevocably. Sharon approached him on the porch that night, her expression both gentle and probing. "You're quiet." Cornell leaned on the railing, eyes fixed on the shimmering water. "They thought they could erase me, make me a trespasser on my own property. Now the marina's mine, the leverage is mine. But respect doesn't come from ownership alone. It comes from action, from consistency." The first confrontation with the HOA was inevitable. Within days, Janice Kettering discovered the transfer of ownership. The news hit her like a thunderclap. She had carried her authority like armor for years, wielding a clipboard and a string of fines as if they were absolute power. But the papers in Cornell's hand now invalidated her perceived dominion. Emails went out immediately. "Attention residents. The Lakeside Marina has changed ownership. This development is serious. Your access may be jeopardized. Stay vigilant." The tone was sharp, designed to ignite concern and suspicion. Cornell read the forwarded messages quietly, Sharon leaning over his shoulder. "She makes it sound like I'm some kind of outlaw," he said softly. Sharon squeezed his hand. "Ignore the noise. You own it. That's the truth." But Janice's campaign worked on the psyche of the community. The following weekend, when Cornell drove down to inspect the docks, a small crowd had gathered. Handmade signs read, "Save our Marina," and "Stop the takeover." Anger and fear radiated from their voices. Janice stood at the center, clipboard in hand, orchestrating the protest with precision. The air was thick with tension, a storm threatening to break. Cornell stepped from his truck, hands in his pockets, posture calm but unyielding. Silence fell as dozens of eyes turned toward him. Some faces twisted in anger, others in uncertainty. Janice's voice cut through first. Well, the new landlord arrives. Care to explain why you think you can dictate our access?" Cornell's response was measured, deliberate. "I don't need to explain. I purchased the marina legally. It was for sale. I made a legitimate transaction. The slips are available, lease agreements remain fair, and I will maintain them responsibly. The only difference is who you write the check to." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. One man shouted about potential fee hikes, about being shut out. Cornell's voice remained calm. "Fees will remain fair. No one will be shut out. Respect goes both ways. I won't tolerate being treated like I don't belong, nor will I let anyone else face that humiliation." Janice raised her clipboard as if wielding a weapon. "What about accountability? The HOA ensured everyone had a voice. You are a single individual. What guarantees do we have?" Cornell stepped forward, gaze unwavering. "What accountability did you show when you called the sheriff on me fishing on my own land? What accountability did you show when lies spread about my ownership? Respect is earned, not assumed. You didn't give it then. I will ensure it now." Some faces softened, murmurs of agreement threading through the crowd. A hesitant woman spoke up. "If you put your promises in writing, maybe people would feel secure." Cornell nodded. "Reasonable. I will draft clear agreements for every leaseholder. No tricks. No surprises." Janice's face flushed with frustration, realizing her authority had been directly challenged. For the first time, she struggled to maintain control. The room's power dynamic had shifted, and Cornell simply stood tall, silent yet commanding. The real test wasn't the protest. It was how Cornell would maintain fairness, assert authority, and withstand the HOA's next moves. Stay with us because the following chapters reveal the ingenious way he turned ownership into influence, and how the community slowly began to see the truth. Don't forget to subscribe to follow the full journey. The following week, Cornell Dupree arrived at Lakeside Marina before sunrise, the pale morning light casting long shadows over the water. The docks creaked in the wind, some boards bowed under years of neglect. For weeks, he had watched from a distance, calculating the repairs, planning the logistics. Now, with legal ownership firmly in his hands, the real work began. He climbed out of his truck, dusting his boots, and surveyed the marina. The gentle sway of idle boats reflected the golden light of dawn. A few early risers waved, uncertain whether to greet him or maintain distance. Cornell simply nodded, acknowledging their presence without condescension. Ownership wasn't about intimidation, it was about stewardship. He had already contacted a small local crew. The men were reliable, experienced, and accustomed to working under the unforgiving Texas sun. They had gathered at the dock, tools in hand, ready to tackle the first wave of repairs, replacing rotting planks, reinforcing supports, and inspecting the slips for safety hazards. Cornell joined them, hammer in hand, not to prove authority but to lead by example. As hammers clanged and saws buzzed, the energy of the marina shifted. Where once there had been uncertainty and fear, there was now tangible progress. Families watching from the shore began to murmur among themselves. Franklin Yates appeared mid-morning, his fishing hat slightly askew, observing the transformation. "Looks better already," he commented, gesturing to the freshly replaced planks. "Haven't seen work like this here since the 90s. Cornell smiled faintly. "If I'm going to own it, might as well take care of it." Meanwhile, the HOA had begun mobilizing behind the scenes. Janice Kettering, frustrated by the sudden shift in power, had launched a quiet campaign to rally the residents. Emails and messages circulated warning of uncertain management, potential fee hikes, and hostile takeover language that painted Cornell as an opportunist rather than a responsible property owner. Cornell and Sharon sat that evening at their kitchen table, reviewing the messages forwarded by Franklin. "She makes it sound like I'm some kind of outlaw," Cornell muttered, scanning the carefully worded warnings. Sharon's voice was steady and calm. "Ignore the noise. You own it. That's the truth. Let the work speak for itself." The tension continued as residents began arriving at the marina. Some curious, others cautious, a few still loyal to Janice's narrative. The first test came when a couple approached Cornell, hesitant but polite. "Mr. Dupree," one said, "we weren't sure what would happen with the slips. Are things going to change?" Cornell met their gaze calmly. "No. The slips remain available. The lease agreements will be fair, transparent, and honored. The only change is who you pay." The couple exchanged glances and nodded. A small victory, but an important one. Action was beginning to override rumor. By midweek, the docks were taking shape. The structure felt solid, the wood fresh, the marina slowly regaining its dignity. Residents who had once whispered behind phones or expressed suspicion now observed from a distance, curiosity tempered with growing respect. Cornell supervised quietly, ensuring the crew adhered to high standards, but never micromanaging. His presence alone reminded everyone that responsibility, not fear, dictated this new order. The HOA, however, was far from defeated. Janice continued her campaign, holding informal gatherings and speaking to loyal residents about potential risks under Cornell's ownership. Rumors about hidden agendas and financial instability spread, and some residents hesitated to sign the new lease agreements. It was a delicate dance, balancing transparency and authority against the weight of lingering suspicion. Cornell knew that winning hearts wasn't about confrontation. It was about consistent, reliable action. Every repair completed, every slip maintained, every resident treated fairly chipped away at the narrative Janice had tried to control. Franklin's subtle support proved invaluable. "People see what they need to see," he reminded Cornell during a brief break in the work. "Don't rush it. Let them witness it." By the weekend, more residents were engaging directly. A young family with 2 children approached, expressing initial concerns about fee increases. Cornell listened attentively. "I understand your concerns," he said. "Fees will be fair, and I will communicate openly if any adjustments are ever necessary. You rely on this, Marina, and I respect that. My goal isn't to profit unfairly. It's to maintain what you've always had access to." One by one, hesitations gave way to tentative agreements. Small signs of trust emerged. Nods, quiet comments of appreciation, a few hesitant smiles. Cornell didn't celebrate these minor victories publicly. Instead, he focused on the work, letting results speak louder than words. The tension wasn't just among residents. Janice escalated privately, filing a complaint with the county claiming that Cornell's ownership violated community covenants. The county clerk, however, dismissed the case almost immediately. The deed was clear, the sale legal. Cornell received the notice, tucked it into a drawer, and moved on. Legal obstacles had been neutralized. By late summer, the marina began to transform. Fresh paint coated the weathered wood. Reinforced docks stood firm against gentle waves, and new lights cast a warm glow over the water at dusk. Families returned, laughter and conversation filling the once tense space. Even skeptics had to admit that Cornell's methodical, fair approach was restoring the marina to its rightful function. Cornell remained quietly observant. Each interaction reinforced his principle. Respect couldn't be demanded. It had to be shown and maintained. Every decision, every repair, every lease agreement underlined that belief. The same neighbors who had once watched him endure humiliation on the lake were now depending on him for access, not through confrontation, but through consistent, principled action. But while Cornell's work was transforming the marina, Janice Kettering wasn't finished. Her influence still lingered, and the next chapter would test not just his legal ownership, but his ability to maintain authority while navigating a divided community. Stay with us. Subscribe to witness how one man's quiet strength turns resistance into respect and how the marina becomes more than just docks and water. It becomes a statement. By early September, Lakeside Marina had begun to show signs of true revival. The docks, once rotting and unreliable, now stood firm, polished planks catching the afternoon sun. Families slowly returned, their laughter echoing across the water. Yet, beneath this surface of renewal, tension simmered. Janice Kettering, relentless and determined, refused to accept the shift in power. Word of Cornell's ownership had spread like wildfire through the subdivision. Quiet whispers in grocery stores and hardware shops became conversations in front yards and at stoplights. The HOA president, clipboard in hand, orchestrated a campaign of doubt. Rumors circulated that Cornell's intentions were self-serving, that fees might spike unexpectedly, and that residents could lose access at any moment. Cornell had anticipated resistance, but the next confrontation took him by surprise in its intensity. One Friday evening, a flyer appeared on every mailbox within the subdivision, a formal announcement of an HOA meeting scheduled for the following week. Its language was calculated to provoke: Lakeside Marina under new management. Risks to our community access. Come voice your concerns. The residents were being called to question his ownership, to publicly challenge the man who had legally purchased what was rightfully his. Cornell discussed the flyer with Sharon over coffee that night. "They're trying to turn people against me," he said, stirring his cup absent-mindedly. Sharon's expression was calm, almost comforting. "Let them speak," she said. "Your deeds, your actions, your fairness. That's your answer. They can yell and whisper all they want, but truth is visible." The night of the meeting, Cornell drove slowly into the subdivision. The clubhouse loomed ahead, low and brick, fluorescent lights glowing faintly through its windows. Folding chairs had been set up, rows tightly packed, and a murmur of voices filled the air. Residents were curious, apprehensive, and some openly hostile. Inside, Janice stood at the head table, her clipboard stacked with notes and talking points. The room felt heavy, almost tense, as she addressed the crowd, her voice sharp and precise. "As you all know, Lakeside Marina has changed hands. Mr. Cornell Dupree is not a subdivision resident. This raises serious concerns about community access and management. Her words were deliberate, intended to stir doubt and unease. Murmurs rippled across the room. Cornell, standing quietly in the back, allowed the initial agitation to wash over him. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react. He had learned that silence, when paired with preparedness and integrity, could be far more powerful than immediate confrontation. When the room settled slightly, Cornell stepped forward. His boots echoed softly on the tile floor, the weight of his presence commanding attention. "I didn't come here to fight anyone," he began, voice calm but carrying the weight of authority earned through years of hard work. "2 weeks ago, I was treated like a trespasser on my own lake. Deputies were called. Neighbors watched. Phones recorded. I showed my deed, but the damage was done. That experience changed nothing legally, but it changed how I viewed responsibility. I bought this marina not to take away anyone's access, but to ensure that what belongs to me, and to those who use it responsibly, remains protected." A few skeptical faces in the crowd narrowed their eyes, whispering quietly. One man called out, "So you bought it to get even?" Cornell's gaze swept across the room, steady and unflinching. "No," he said. "I bought it because it was for sale, and because I refuse to be erased from a place I have the right to call mine. You rely on this marina. I understand that, and I will honor it. Lease agreements remain fair, transparent, and unchanged, except now they're signed by me, the legal owner." Janice's lips pressed tight, her composure slipping slightly as murmurs of agreement began to weave through the crowd. Cornell continued, his tone softening but firm. "Respect goes both ways. You cannot call the sheriff on someone on their own land, then demand loyalty without providing it. I'm here to provide fairness, not fear. If anyone is concerned about lease fees, repairs, or future management, I am open to discussion. Everything will be documented, clear and straightforward. No hidden clauses, no surprises. That is my promise." Some residents, previously loyal to Janice, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A woman raised her hand hesitantly. "If we can't afford increases down the line, will you ensure caps?" Cornell nodded respectfully. "Yes, I make my living from my ranch, not these slips. My goal isn't to profit unfairly, it's to maintain what you already have access to." The room's atmosphere began to change. The whispers softened, replaced by a cautious curiosity. Even some of Janice's staunch supporters couldn't help but acknowledge the calm authority in Cornell's words. A slow, hesitant clap began at the back of the room, growing as a few others joined. The power dynamic had subtly shifted, but Janice's influence lingered, albeit diminished. After the meeting, as people filed out, a few residents approached Cornell quietly. "Thank you for clarifying," one man said. "I wasn't sure what to expect." Another woman nodded. "If you keep it fair, you'll have our support." Cornell thanked them without fanfare, letting his actions continue to speak louder than words. Back at the ranch that evening, he sat on the porch with Sharon. The air was warm, tinged with the scent of wildflowers and the lake's calm reflection. "You made a stand today," Sharon said softly. "I just told the truth," Cornell replied, eyes on the horizon. "But she isn't finished. I could see it in her eyes. She'll fight every inch." Sharon rested her hand over his. "Then fight smart, because now the whole neighborhood is watching. Show them through action, not words." Cornell looked at the water, its surface calm yet shimmering with latent potential. He understood the truth Sharon spoke. This wasn't just a marina, or a lake, or even a legal victory. It was about dignity, integrity, and demonstrating that respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned. And yet, despite the calm of the evening, Cornell knew the next challenge would test not only his ownership but the very trust of the community. What would it take to turn reluctant skeptics into allies? To ensure the marina's future wasn't clouded by doubt? Stay tuned. Subscribe now, because the story is about to reveal how one man's quiet determination reshapes an entire neighborhood. The days after the HOA meeting brought an uneasy calm to the subdivision. While Cornell's words had shifted the atmosphere, Actions would speak louder than any argument, and he knew it. He returned to Lakeside Marina with a sense of purpose sharper than ever. Each plank, each slip, each line of paperwork became a symbol of integrity and fairness, and his quiet determination began to ripple through the community. Cornell started by drafting lease agreements for every resident, taking painstaking care to ensure clarity and transparency. The documents were simple yet comprehensive. Fair prices, no hidden fees, clear maintenance responsibilities, and capped increases in case of unexpected repairs. For the first time in years, residents could see exactly what they were signing, and it was under Cornell's direct supervision, not the HOA's ambiguous rules. Sharon watched him work late into the evenings. "You're not just managing a marina," she said softly. "You're proving something bigger." Cornell didn't respond immediately, but the slight smile that crossed his face revealed that he understood her point. This was more than property management. It was about respect, accountability, and showing the community that fairness could exist without intimidation. Word of his diligence spread quietly, often by word of mouth. Franklin Yates, who had been a silent supporter from the beginning, became a quiet ambassador. "People are noticing," he said one afternoon, leaning on his fishing pole while watching Cornell oversee dock repairs. "They may not admit it yet, but they see you're keeping your word. That means something." Cornell nodded, wiping sweat from his brow as he inspected a newly reinforced dock. "It has to mean more than words," he said. "Action builds trust, and trust lasts longer than gossip." Despite these quiet victories, Janice Kettering was far from done. Her next move came swiftly. A formal complaint filed with the county, claiming that Cornell's ownership violated subdivision covenants. She painted the narrative of a hostile takeover, hoping to rally any hesitant residents and force Cornell into a defensive position. But this time, the law and truth were firmly on his side. The county clerk reviewed the documentation, the deeds, tax records, and purchase agreements, and dismissed the complaint immediately. The legality of Cornell's ownership was undeniable. As the weeks passed, the marina began to transform. The once fragile docks were reinforced, fresh planks gleamed under the sun, and a few new lights cast a soft glow over the water at night. Families returned with a sense of cautious optimism. Kids ran down the piers, laughter carried across the water, and even those who had questioned Cornell's motives started nodding in approval at the visible improvements. Cornell made a point of interacting with the residents. He answered questions, explained the terms of the leases, and listened to concerns. He never bragged, never belittled, and never let past humiliation influence his demeanor. He understood that respect was earned over time, not forced through confrontation. Slowly, the narrative began to shift. Where there had been whispers and suspicion, there was now acknowledgement and quiet appreciation. One afternoon, a woman approached him cautiously. She had been vocal during the initial protests, her doubts palpable. "Mr. Dupree," she said, voice soft and hesitant, "I wanted to thank you. My husband and I were worried. But you've been fair. More than fair. We were wrong." Cornell studied her for a moment, nodded once, and replied simply, "I'm not here to push anyone out. I'm here to do what's right." By late summer, the marina had settled into a rhythm. Lease agreements were signed, maintenance schedules were followed, and residents began to treat Cornell not as an outsider, but as a reliable presence. A man who honored his word and respected theirs. Even the staunchest critics found it difficult to dispute the visible progress. Janice Kettering, however, still lingered in the background. Her influence had waned, yet she continued to challenge the narrative subtly, whispering doubts and spreading concern. But her efforts increasingly rang hollow against the tangible reality Cornell had established. The marina, now under his careful management, stood as proof of what steady action and principled determination could accomplish. Cornell didn't gloat, didn't seek revenge. He simply worked, letting results speak louder than words. And the results were undeniable. Where once there had been hostility, there was now cooperation. Where there had been suspicion, there was now trust. Families who had once looked on with skepticism now approached him with questions about repairs, lease terms, or even advice on property upkeep. Even the small victories mattered. One afternoon, Franklin Yates leaned on the dock railing, a grin tugging at his sun-weathered face. "Funny how ownership changes a man," he said. "You walk in quiet, steady, and suddenly folks see who's running things. Not through shouting or threats, but by doing right." Cornell simply nodded, surveying the marina as a group of children chased a dog across the planks, laughter mingling with the gentle slap of water. And yet, Cornell understood that the true test of his integrity wasn't the repairs or the lease agreements. It was consistency. He would need to continue proving, day after day, that ownership came with responsibility and fairness, that he could be trusted even by those who had doubted him the most. The real challenge was not the confrontation with Janice, but earning and maintaining the community's quiet respect. And as the neighborhood adjusted to this new reality, one question lingered. Would Cornell's quiet authority finally settle the unrest once and for all? Or would Janice and her remaining loyalists attempt one last disruptive move? Stay with us. Subscribe now, because the story is about to reach a dramatic turning point in the final segment. The late summer sun dipped low over the subdivision, casting a warm glow on Lakeside Marina. The air was alive with the hum of families, laughter bouncing off the docks, and the subtle slap of water against the hulls of boats. For Cornell Dupree, every step across the gravel and wood of the marina now carried a sense of quiet triumph. What had begun as humiliation, the flashing lights, the deputies, the whispers of neighbors, had transformed into a testament of patience, persistence, and principled action. Cornell walked among the docks, inspecting the recent repairs, nodding to residents as they approached. Some still looked hesitant, their trust not fully formed, but the majority had begun to see him not as a trespasser or an outsider, but as the steady hand ensuring the marina's success. Lease agreements were signed, the terms were clear, and families could finally relax, knowing they had fair access to the water. No hidden fees, no surprises, no intimidation, just transparency, and that was Cornell's quiet victory. Even Janice Kettering felt the shift, though she would never admit it publicly. Her emails and whispered warnings had failed to shake the community's growing confidence in Cornell's leadership. Her clipboard, once a symbol of absolute authority, now carried less weight than the deeds in his name. Residents began approaching her with questions that Cornell's work had answered in advance, their faith in process and fairness stronger than their loyalty to her arbitrary rules. One Saturday evening, as the sun dipped behind the tall oaks lining the marina, Cornell and Sharon stood together on the dock, watching families pack coolers and stow fishing gear. Children ran freely, dogs splashed at the water's edge, and the air carried a calm that had been missing for months. Sharon's hand rested lightly on his shoulder. "You turned this around," she said softly. "Without shouting, without anger. You just let your actions speak. That's why they respect you now." Cornell allowed himself a faint smile, rubbing his calloused hands together. "Respect isn't a trophy someone hands you," he replied. "It's earned, brick by brick. I didn't buy this place to own people. I bought it to protect what's mine and show that fairness matters." Even Franklin Yates, who had watched the entire journey unfold with a knowing grin, stopped by to shake Cornell's hand. "Sometimes the best revenge," Franklin said, hat in hand, "is just doing right. You didn't fight fire with fire, you fought it with principle." Cornell nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction. The memory of flashing patrol lights, hostile neighbors, and Janice's accusations lingered, but it no longer burned with shame or anger. Those moments had been transformed into a powerful story of dignity reclaimed. The weeks rolled into months. Cornell continued overseeing the marina, ensuring maintenance, attending to residents' concerns, and quietly reinforcing the principles of fairness. The boats remained safe in their slips, the docks sturdy and well-maintained, and the once tense community began to embrace the new normal. Where gossip and doubt had once flourished, there was now trust and appreciation. Even the most vocal critics began to soften. Residents who had questioned Cornell's motives now approached him with smiles, inquiries about ranch life or casual conversation, acknowledging him as part of their community, not by force, but because he had proven himself trustworthy. Janice Kettering, though still technically in power as HOA president, found her influence waning. Her words carried less weight when residents saw, in plain sight, the results of Cornell's steadfastness. Cornell never flaunted his victory. He didn't rub his ownership in anyone's face, nor did he indulge in the humiliation he had endured. Instead, he continued running the marina as he did his ranch, with patience, discipline, and a quiet, steady authority. His actions became the example of how dignity, truth, and fairness could outlast fear, intimidation, and gossip. One evening, as the sun painted the lake in shades of gold and pink, a woman who had once protested the marina approached him. Hesitant, she lowered her eyes. "Mr. Dupree," she said softly, "I just wanted to thank you. I was worried at first, but you've been fair, more than fair. I was wrong." Cornell studied her briefly, then nodded simply. "I'm not here to push anyone out. I'm here to do what's right." The woman smiled faintly and walked back to her family, the gesture of acknowledgement heavier than any applause. Cornell climbed into his truck, the water shimmering in his rearview mirror, reflecting the calm that had finally settled over Lakeside Marina. For the first time since the deputies had arrived, he felt the weight lift, not because Janice had lost, but because dignity had been restored. Not only his own, but the kind that comes when truth, patience, and steady action outlast noise, intimidation, and false authority. That night, Cornell and Sharon sat on the porch at the ranch. The crickets sang, the moon cast a gentle glow on the lake, and a soft breeze carried the scent of oak and water. Cornell spoke almost to himself, reflective yet firm. "They tried to take my dignity with a phone call, tried to humiliate me in front of neighbors, but look at how it turned out. You don't beat noise with more noise. You beat it with persistence, with truth, with quiet strength." Sharon slipped her hand into his, her voice gentle yet firm. "Maybe that's the lesson everyone needed to see." Cornell nodded slowly, gazing out over the water. The story of humiliation, resistance, and triumph finally reaching its quiet, undeniable conclusion. The story of Cornell Dupree might not have made headlines across the nation, but for those who witnessed it, it left an indelible mark. It was a story of resilience, fairness, and dignity reclaimed. It was proof that real power doesn't come from shouting, false authority, or intimidation. It comes from steady action, integrity, and refusing to bend when you know you are right. And for everyone who has ever been humiliated, dismissed, or told they don't belong, Cornell's journey stands as a reminder. Dignity is not granted by others. It is carried with you, even when the world watches, even when the voices around you doubt or challenge. If the story of quiet strength, fairness, and persistence inspired you, don't let it end here. Click the subscribe button now to see more real-life stories of ordinary people standing tall against injustice, proving that courage, patience, and principle always leave a mark. Cornell Dupree's journey began with humiliation. Lights flashing, deputies arriving, neighbors whispering, and could have ended in resentment. Instead, it became a story of quiet resilience. He didn't respond with anger, lawsuits, or threats. He responded with persistence, principle, and patience. He bought the marina, not to punish anyone, but to reclaim his dignity and assert the fairness he knew he deserved. Through steady action, he turned the tables. Those who once doubted him, who watched him struggle against gossip and false authority, eventually came to respect him. Families regained safe, fair access to the marina. The docks were repaired, agreements clarified, and a once tense community learned a subtle but powerful lesson. Respect is earned, not demanded. Cornell never flaunted his victory. He didn't need to. His deeds spoke louder than words or emails or rumors. His story shows us that when we stand firm for what is right, when we act with integrity, even the loudest voices cannot overpower truth. This isn't just a story about a lake or a marina. It's about dignity, about knowing your worth, and about the quiet, unstoppable power of principle. It's about facing injustice head-on and turning humiliation into a legacy of respect. So whenever the world doubts you, Whenever someone tries to write you out or humiliate you, remember Cornell Dupree. Strength isn't always loud, and victories aren't always dramatic. Sometimes the most powerful wins come quietly, with patience, courage, and unwavering integrity. If Cornell's story inspired you, if you believe in standing tall in the face of injustice, make sure to subscribe for more stories that show how ordinary people turn trials into triumphs. Remember, dignity isn't given. It's carried with you, and its impact lasts far longer than the noise around you.